Show yourself. If not, I won't believe in you. Simple.
People can be a little bit more quiet, a little bit more respectful of speakers. Question for Mr. Tabash.
Yes, question for Mr. Tabash. Today I know you were in Atlanta, I heard at the debate that Dr. Craig had with Dr. Peter Atkins, a physical chemist from England. And the question was posed to Dr. Atkins as to what explanation did he give for the disciples coming up with the story of the resurrection, since they were eventually put to death for it, and the best he could come up with was that the disciples were bored, living out in the desert, and they were bored. You haven't yet given an explanation as to why the disciples came up, or where this the story of the resurrection came from. Can you answer that question, please?
First of all, the idea of resurrection was always floating around. Now, even though the Jews thought of the resurrection at the end of time, and they didn't think of some individual Messiah resurrecting, the mythology or the template, the basis for that was always there. Secondly, you cannot argue that just because people come up with a new mythology in an already superstitious age, that means that something it has to be true. So if you have people believing in reincarnation, and then the next day they say, you know what, rather than reincarnation after death, we all go to a planet made of green cheese, that doesn't mean that it's true. What you're trying to say is that the fact that people make a paradigm shift is evidence of the supernatural. And I'm saying on the principle of conservatism, the explanation which is the most reasonable, there are other more rational and logical and provable explanations than to say the supernatural. Again, if Dr. Craig was at the LA airport tomorrow dancing Hare Krishna, that would be such a paradigm shift for him, but that doesn't mean that the Hare Krishna religion is true.
When you have a paradigm shift like this, the historian is obligated to provide some explanation for why this occurred. And Eddie hasn't given us any explanation of why this group of men, broken, dispirited, crushed by the crucifixion of Jesus, which under Old Testament teaching showed this man out to be a heretic. It meant that he could not have been Messiah if they had entertained such hopes. Why this band of men should suddenly and sincerely come to believe such an un-Jewish thing as that God raised him from the dead, such that they would be willing to go to tortuous deaths for this. Now, I just ask, what is the explanation for this, along with the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances? The historian has to provide something. And I think the best explanation is these men were telling the truth. Why not believe them?
Do you have a question for Dr. Craig? Do you have a question?
I have a question for both parties, and if whoever is up can answer first. I would like to each to comment on the following. Recently, physicists have discovered there is enough dark matter in the universe to pull the universe back in after it expands, and an ever-expanding and contracting universe, so that there are lots of Big Bangs all through time, whatever time is. There was never a beginning, there never was one Big Bang, it was just always there. There's always been matter, there always will be matter, ever-expanding and contracting, and how does that fit into each of your sides?
What you've described is the oscillating model of the universe, and I think that your information is simply out of date here. I have here a AP news release from January 9th of last year, which indicates that 5 teams of astronomers at Princeton, Harvard, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and so forth, have determined that the universe is not dense enough for it to recontract. In fact, the expansion is actually accelerating. According to an article I have here, just from January 10th. January 10th, it says that this about destroys the idea that there could be any way for the universe to come back together into a big crunch. So that this old oscillating model simply won't work. It's cosmologically and observationally untenable. There was an absolute beginning. And you've got to explain why did that event occur? Where did the universe come from?
Well, whether or not the universe accordions, expands and contracts, is not really the issue. The issue is that if there was a beginning, and the Big Bang was the beginning, you cannot impute our understanding of cause and effect in time and space to an event before time and space. That is to say, if the universe is 15 million years ago, there wasn't a 16 million years ago. There was no time before time at which a causal event could take place? And also, if God is an immaterial entity, how does God reach out from immateriality to effect an event in the material universe? Again, Dr. Craig says, well, his mind, which is immaterial, can make his arm raise. But Dr. Craig's mind works through a platform of a physical brain. There is no physical brain or medium from which God to work through. So therefore, the concept of a supernatural cause of the beginning of time and space is pure speculation without any justification.
You have a question, Mr. Tabash?
Yes, Mr. Tabash, if you would grant that the suffering that your mother went through in Auschwitz was something that should not have happened, then you would be implying that there's a way that things ought to be. But without God, how would you define the way things ought to be, or a design that things ought to be?
See, I don't need recourse to a supernatural being to look upon the scenes in Auschwitz and say this shouldn't happen. I don't need recourse to a supernatural being to say that the Serbian militiamen should not shoot down innocent women and children in Bosnia. I don't need recourse to a supernatural being to say that the serial killer should not kill his victims. I don't need recourse to a supernatural being to say that 2 and 2 is 4. I don't need recourse to a supernatural being to say I should not drive 150 miles down Pacific Coast Highway. The impact, the evidence of our senses, and the empirical knowledge we derive from living is our guide. But I don't need a supernatural God to say, by the way, in my absence, Auschwitz shouldn't have happened, when it was that supernatural God, if he's all-powerful, who let it happen.
Well, again, Eddie just doesn't understand the argument. The point isn't that you need God to learn what is objectively right and wrong. It is that you need God's foundation for moral values. Otherwise, everything becomes relative, socioculturally relative. And there's no basis for affirming the value of human beings. Think of my example of the aliens from outer space coming and looking at us the way we look at pigs and cows. Why think human beings are essentially valuable on the atheistic view? The argument that the student asks is actually a very good one. It's an argument for God from evil. It goes like this. Evil is that which ought not to be, by definition. But if there is a way that the universe ought to be, that implies there's a design plan for the universe. But if there is a design plan for the universe, there must be a designer of the universe. And thus, again, from the very concept of evil as that which ought not to be, you see that there must be a designer of the universe and a source of moral value.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question for each of the participants. There will be, if you have questions that you would like to ask, there will be a reception immediately following this out in the foyer. So, one more question for each.
Dr. Craig, I'm a survivor of the Holocaust from Belgium, and I want everybody to know that all the Nazis who were very good Christians had godly rules on the belt buckles.
I can't quite understand. Could you speak more slowly and distinctly? I can't quite understand.
I want everybody to know that the Nazis were very good Christians, and that Hitler was a Catholic, never got excommunicated, by the way, and they followed the Christian gods and Christian religion, and they massacred and murdered 6 million innocent people, men, women, and children. My family included. I was a lucky one, I survived. How do you explain the silence of the God, or all the gods, why this was happening?
Well, in the first place, Hitler and the Nazi soldiers who carried out this atrocity were not Christians. Even if they claimed to be members of churches, being a member of a church doesn't make you a Christian. That is not what it means to be a Christian. Jesus would not have been a guard of Auschwitz. The others in the gas chamber. So I'm defending what Jesus stood and taught for, not what religious hypocrites who claim to be his followers have done. But with respect to the Holocaust, I think God had morally sufficient reasons for permitting that atrocity. For example, I don't know this, but perhaps the Holocaust was the means by which the founding of the modern nation of Israel was brought about. Through such an extraordinary atrocity, the world returned to the Jews their ancient homeland, and the Bible says that God has ways of using Israel to bless the entire world that lie in the future. We simply have no way of knowing what good